goes on in the cross-modal. It's back on again. Okay. And look at some of the factors that seem to modulate multisensory integration in humans, in animals, and some of the ways in which those insights can be applied to the design of, say, warning signals for drivers. I've got a picture of the brain on the front, not because I'll tell you much about the brain today, but just because the latest research suggests you're much more likely to believe whatever I tell you with a coupled brain image up there. A number of studies coming to the same conclusion. You're more easily persuaded by this than you would be without such powerful images. So the traditional way of thinking about the senses, and this is true, be it if you're interested in well-being and massage and aromatherapy, as in this book here, entitled The Five Senses, but if you're interested in psychology, psychophysics, neuroscience, wherever you look really for decades, the traditional view has been to take each sense individually, study it in isolation, try and learn as much as we can, and then just kind of add those things together because the brain is such a complex organism, and the problems of kind of integrating the senses are so hard. Perhaps the best we can do, at least for many years or decades, is to study the senses individually. And I see that even in my own department in Oxford, I have until he retired last week, the visual psychologist in one lab. Next door, the auditory psychophysicist in another lab, and they haven't spoken for 20 years. They're both interested in perception, but they just don't see eye to eye or ear to ear, and think they can go on forever in their own unisensory world. But I think the more that we study the brain, more we see it's a multisensory organ through and through, to the extent that some people now are questioning whether there really are any unisensory parts. Does it really make sense to call something visual cortex or auditory cortex? Or is it all really, in some sense, multisensory? Some it's slightly more visual, but nevertheless still multisensory. That's one ongoing debate. And one of the other reasons why multisensory integration is becoming so popular is that wherever you look in the animal kingdom, or down to the level of single-cell organisms that respond to heat and chemical gradients, no one seems to have found an organism that has more than one sense, and I think that all organisms do have at least two senses, where those senses are kept in isolation. It just wouldn't make sense, because you might have one sense telling you go that way, the other sense telling you go the other way, and if those senses weren't combined, the organism wouldn't know what to do, and hence it seems to be a sort of fundamental of perception in any species that you have multiple senses, and those senses are integrated for the coordination of action and behaviour. One of the other reasons why multisensory perception is growing in interest is the idea that many of our most enjoyable experiences, be it a meal in a fine restaurant, are multisensory. You have to have the smell, the taste, the temperature, the colour, and the sound of the food, all senses contributing to that enjoyable experience. And if you read Stein and Meredith's landmark book on the merging of the senses, documenting these neurophysiologists' quarter-century research studying single cells and the superior colliculus, about which more in a moment, we'll see their claim that integrated sensory inputs produced far richer experiences than would be predicted from their simple coexistence or the linear sum of their individual products. The integration of inputs from different sensory modalities not only transforms some of their individual characteristics, I'll see a few examples of that, but does so in ways that can enhance the quality of life. Kind of a grand claim that they're trying to sell their book. But I think we're coming to the point now where we are seeing more and more examples where better understanding of multisensory integration in humans and other species can be used to deliver enhanced perception experiences to consumers and others. And as was mentioned by Tony, in a way people have been thinking about the senses and how they interact for a long time. We can go back to kind of the very foundations of experimental psychology in Leipzig in the 1870s. And there'll be people like Wundt and others interested in the kind of complication situation, in the question of timing. If I see a flash of light and I hear a sound, how do I know if they're simultaneous or not, or which one came first? How do I kind of shift my perception from one sense to another? So there has been some research on multisensory perception for over a century now, but the problem up until about, I guess, 1950 or 1960 was results were kind of inconsistent. Somebody would find an effect of smell on colour on hearing, but the next researcher failed to replicate it, didn't know quite what the conditions were that were crucial to enhancing integration. So you get up to the 1950s or so, and there's kind of people talking about multisensory perception, and then interest dies out as people can't replicate, understand what's going on. Emerges again a decade later, and then fades. But I think since the 1960s, interest has been maintained, perhaps primarily because we now understand better the factors modulating integration. And as far as I can see, there are kind of two main approaches that have guided research and understanding and helped to deliver what is such a fruitful the first approach, as mentioned by Tony again, was from the kind of philosophical musings about how one sense educates another, Bishop Berkeley and all the rest in the 18th century. And that follows through to studies in the 1940s of the ventriloquist effect. Why is it that I hear the voice of this man here, circa 1970 in Hull, I think, the voice coming out of these articulated lips of the dummy over here? At one level, I know the voice isn't coming from the teddy bear. At another level, my brain is automatically integrating the signals and saying it's far more likely that the sound actually came from where I see the lips move, because vision is a very accurate sense in terms of spatial localization. Other examples of this kind of sensory dominance, so examples where individual sensory inputs are put into conflict. I hear one thing, I see something else. What does the human perceive, and how can we model it? Comes from research on the McGurk effect. Here, one very nice demonstration from Vicky Bruce in Scotland, where if you look at the face on the left, you should hear bar. You should hear da or tha instead. So now, whenever you look to the left, you'll hear one thing, bar. Whenever you look to the right, you'll hear something else. You can kind of close your eyes and tell what your brain's really hearing. It's really kind of a muffled bar sound. But once you open your eyes again, look at this face on the right, you cannot stop yourself hearing the da. You know it's really a bar, but your brain integrates automatically, seemingly effortlessly, and in a way in which you can't introspect upon, and only gives you conscious awareness to the results of integration. As mentioned, discovered in the 1970s, but one of the most powerful examples of the automaticity of audiovisual integration in this case. Despite what people say they're hearing, we can show the importance of vision to this and other illusions of sensory dominance. Again, here the rubber hand illusion. What happens again when you put the senses in conflict? You have the subject's hand on the left, hidden from view, a joke shop, rubber hand, a bit of cheap virtual reality, if you will, over here, and the experimenter strokes both hands in synchrony. Within a few seconds, on average about 10 or 11, most subjects will experience this as their right hand. It might start to feel rubbery. If they try to point to it with their left hand under the table, they'll point closer to this fake hand than to their own real one. Not only that, their own body will start to cool down. Specifically, this limb here will drop in temperature by about 1/4 of a degree. The bigger the drop in temperature, correlating with the stronger perceptual illusion. Just three effects here: the ventriloquist effect, the rubber hand illusion, and the McGurk effect. Kind of capturing the traditional approach of psychologists, where you present supra-threshold stimuli to different senses, and you see how the brain resolves that conflict. What do people perceive? Do they bind those stimuli? Do they do it automatically? And can we explain what's going on? I think we can. I think tomorrow's speaker, Mark Ernst, will say a lot more about this kind of sensory integration, sensory dominance, and binding. So I won't mention any more about that today, but just say this is one approach to studying and understanding multisensory perception that I think can be set against an alternative approach that's come much more from the neurophysiologists than from the psychologists and philosophers, and is based not so much on the perception or resolution of conflict of supra-threshold signals, but by looking at orienting responses to very near-threshold or sub-threshold stimuli, originally in the anaesthetized cat, and then we want to see, will the rules derived from such studies help to predict human perception, behavior, and performance. And it's on this kind of neurophysiologically inspired approach that I want to focus on for the rest of today. And this is all research done primarily by Stein and Meredith from the 70s up to the present day, primarily focused on the cat as the animal of interest. For many years in the anaesthetized cat, looking at what's going on in the superior colliculus, a very small part of the brain, but easy to get to if you're a neurophysiologist, that seems to be involved in orienting attention, directing the eyes, the head, the gaze to events of interest in the environment around us. And Stein and Meredith and their colleagues have made some very strong claims over the years that by studying the rules of integration in this very small part of the brain, we can figure out what's important, what rules determine which stimuli we bind, which stimuli we keep separate. So by understanding the rules of integration at the single cell level, we can then predict what will happen in other parts of the brain, and also for other behaviours or percepts that aren't controlled by this subcortical structure. And there are 3 or 4 key findings that come out of this research. One is a very powerful notion, this idea of superadditivity. One of perhaps the key reasons why you can't study the senses individually, because you cannot predict what their interaction will give rise to in perception, in the brain, at the single cell level. We take this one kind of cartoon example here, I think from the best cell that Stein and Meredith ever recorded from. We find a cell that responds very little to what's heard, that visual signals don't really elicit much activity, but put those 2 individually weakly effective signals together, and what you get is a response from the cell that's far bigger than the sum of their parts, far bigger than you'd ever predict by studying the senses individually. And they claim this idea of superadditivity is very important as providing a means of drawing our attention to events of interest in the environment, given we're working with very noisy sensory apparatus. They suggest that each of our senses is likely to fire irregularly, just there's going to be some noise there. But that both seemingly independent sensory systems should fire at the same time. That probably really means something, and as such, you want to boost the signal, so you're more likely to orient to it, to attend to it. It should seem to be brighter or louder than the component signals would lead you to suggest. That's what happens if the senses pull together. They're congruent in space or in time. If you put together sensory signals that don't match, sound in one location, a visual event somewhere else, sound now, light a bit later, the sound of a dog, the picture of a cat, then what you find is even if one of those senses might give you a good signal by itself, put together with a sound that's incongruent, you can actually give rise to a multisensory percept that's kind of subadditive, that's less good than you would have got from the best of the individual senses. So here suggesting that multisensory integration can enhance perception, but also lead to some kind of suppression. And what's critical is the congruency of the input signals, be in space, time, or semantics. And these notions of superadditive neurons, subadditive neurons, as a key way of thinking about multisensory integration, has made it into the psychology and neuroscience and into previous things like this that I've been to. But I think it's important to inject just a couple of notes of caution. One is that cell, that superadditive cell that gave you a 1204% increase in firing because you got the unisensory input right, was the best cell Stein and Meredith ever recorded from. It was somewhere way out here at the tip of this kind of distribution. So this is the distribution of cell responses, where we have many cells that seem to be subadditive, some that seem to be superadditive, and others that just seem to be additive. And there's kind of a danger in much of the neuroscience research just to tell you, the reader, about that cell there, what an amazing superadditive response it had, or about that cell there, very subadditive, and not to mention all those cells in the middle. And kind of in a way, when you look at a distribution like this, you might think it's just what Colliculus is doing at the population level is just kind of additive process. That said, we have to work with the fact that there is this evidence of these individual neurons that are both superadditive and subadditive at the single cell level in the colliculus, and that it is very much the research from the neurophysiologists studying the response of neurons in this area that led the psychologists in the 1970s onwards to think about co-localizing auditory and visual events, co-localizing them in time as well, because the single cell works at the spatial coincidence is a key factor modulating integration. The temporal synchrony between auditory and visual and tactile, any combination of sensory signals, was also key to giving positive multisensory interactions. One other rule that came out of the single cell work was the idea that multisensory integration works best when the individual senses are very weak, hardly give you any response. There's more scope for kind of growth there. And if you have one sense that's doing quite well, you're far less likely to see one of these very big multisensory interactions. So the idea that multisensory integration works best at stimuli somewhere near threshold and declines as stimulus intensity increases. So the 3 rules: spatial rule, temporal rule, law of inverse effectiveness. I want to just focus on the spatial and temporal rules and say has what we've learned at the single cell level in the cat, does that predict behavior, not in an anaesthetized cat, but in an awake cat or in an awake human, not only in the laboratory, but also in real-world settings? How important are the spatial and temporal rules, and when do they affect multisensory integration? So the first step in this direction, I don't want to dwell on it, comes from Stein, following up on the single-cell work, now in the awake cat, now with the cat orienting to the left or right to receive a food reward, in response to a signal that might be visual, auditory, or both. And what we see, what Stein and Meredith and colleagues saw, was that when the sound and light came from the same location in this semicircular display, correct orienting responses, these are the black bars, were far more common. And this benefit of multisensory cues over unisensory auditory or visual cues, shown here in the grey bars, was present at all azimuths, and perhaps, if anything, you see the biggest benefits out here in the periphery when visual perception is worse than, say, apophagia. So co-localizing signals did give rise to increased orienting responses in this awake cat. What happens if you align the signals? Now you see that we have just when the light comes on by itself, the cat nearly always orients to the correct feeding slot. But when you add a sound from a slightly different direction, 30 degrees to the left or the right, then suddenly the cat's confused, we're getting a subadditive response here, and now the cat only correctly gets to eat on about a quarter of the trials. It's evidence, at least, that the spatial rules seem to hold. We have enhanced orienting to spatially co-localized events in hearing and in vision. Does the same hold true in humans? The evidence seems to be yes, at least in certain tasks. So yes, in the case of studies where you as a subject have to orient your eyes and or head to a peripheral target. No matter whether that target is visual, tactile, or auditory, the speed and accuracy of your orienting responses will be better, faster, more accurate if an accessory signal comes from a different modality in the same location. So I'm meant to look at that light that suddenly comes on over there. If the sound comes from the same location, I'm faster. If the sound comes from the opposite location, I'm slow. And the closer those two signals are aligned in space and in time, the better the orienting response will be. Similarly, I think for attention, space seems to matter a lot. This subcortical structure, the colliculus, that's involved in eye and head movements, is also involved in orienting our attention to sudden events of interest. When somebody taps your shoulder or says your name across a crowded cocktail party. And we've done a lot of research in Oxford and in London together with John Driver, looking at whether the spatial rule also holds true in terms of how our attention is moved across space in simple situations where you're in a dark, silent room and you just have to respond to occasionally presented targets, but also in more complex displays like the cocktail party, where there are many voices, many lips, and you're trying to attend to just one voice. And here, think about attention both as a voluntary activity. I want to attend to the guy with a monocle at the back up here. I voluntarily direct my auditory attention to that location in space to enhance my perception of what's being said there. And what our research showed was that your visual attention will be pulled to approximately the same location. So if I attend auditorily to the right, visual attention is drawn to the right. I'll see things better in the same location. If I concentrate on my right hand, I'll also see things better by my right hand. I'll hear things better if the sound comes from this location. So there seems to be strong links between the senses at the endogenous or voluntary level that mean that we only ever, or most of the time, find it easiest to extract information from just one location, regardless of the modality, hearing, vision, touch. But the other way of thinking about attention is this kind of bottom-up capture, as when somebody unexpectedly taps your shoulder. And it turns out there, too, there are strong links between the senses. So that if a sudden event of interest happens, it will draw your attention and you'll enhance processing in all modalities at the location of the cue. Just one example here, we have subjects sit in the laboratory, 4 loudspeakers. One of them plays a sound. You should ignore it. Your task is to say which of these 8 lights turns off. Randomly, any one of the 8. So your task is purely visual. Sound is never relevant to you, but you want to know, will that sound nevertheless capture your attention, and will you then see things more accurately at the location of the sound? So, for example, on this trial, a sound comes from just to the right of central fixation. If we look at people's speed and accuracy of their visual responses as a function of which of these 4 eccentricities the visual target came from, we find that performance is best at the location of the irrelevant sound. So here, for a sound just to the left of fixation, fastest reaction times at that location, performance falling off as a function of increasing separation. By Q on the far left instead, we see the fastest response latencies at that location and performance falling off even within the same heavy field. So it appears that spatial alignment is maintained, and that whenever an event in any modality occurs, it captures your attention and pulls it to that location to enhance the processing of all stimulus modalities perceived to emanate from there. That's all well and good, but of course one problem when you have multiple sensor systems, especially for biological ones, is that these sensor systems can be oriented with respect to one another. I can move my eyes, but not my head. I can move my head, but not my body, my hands with respect to my eyes. Any pair of kind of sensory receptors can be moved with respect to one another. And that creates all sorts of problems in trying to maintain registration between the senses. So I take the case here. If I have a subject looking ahead, we found that a sound to the left of their head led to a shift of visual attention to the left of current fixation. But what happens if the subject keeps their head still, but now moves their gaze and fixates over here? Now the sound is still to the left of their head. Will it still lead to a shift of visual attention to the left of current fixation? Or is the system more intelligent? Is registration maintained? It seems that it is, and that now with fixation over here, visual attention actually shifts to the right instead, to the correct external location, regardless of current posture. And there's a lot of work in the Colliculus on how this registration is maintained as a function of receptor misalignment, kind of known as Poppel's paradox. I first reported it in Nature or Science back in the 70s. The same holds true, I won't mention much of it, about for vision and for touch. If I suddenly touch this hand, vibrate it, pinprick it, then I will see things better in this region of space. I'll find it harder to ignore irrelevant visual events. If I move this hand across the midline and now still touch the same hand, but in a different hemispace, I will now see things better in this location. Move the hand back, I see better here, following a task irrelevant to touch. So for any combination of the spatial senses, hearing, vision and touch, it appears that the brain is capable of updating, maintaining co-registration of the senses, regardless of changes in posture that occur. So maintaining an internal representation of space. How might one use those findings? We've gone then, inspired by the single cell work of Stein and Meredith, through to showing the same kind of spatial rule perhaps in humans. Well, all my research funding comes from industry, and one of the projects we've been working on for the last couple of years is together with Toyota, who have a lot of intelligent stuff going on in their cars. So they have intelligent sensors that can detect what's going on the road in front of your car. They can tell, perhaps, that there's a car round the next corner that's stalled, or a traffic jam, or an accident. We can monitor driver gaze, driver alertness, easily enough. So the car now knows when the driver has diverted their gaze. It knows what's coming around the next corner. It knows we have a potential collision. We need a warning signal, kind of now. And that's what that little red throbbing light from the centre of the dashboard was what the engineers at Toyota had come up with for their kind of top-of-the-range Lexus. This is from about 18 months ago now. So we have these intelligent transport systems. Toyota and the other manufacturers don't want to take control for driving out of the driver's hands. They want the driver to stay in control of their vehicle, partly because that's what drivers like to do and partly for legal reasons. They're able to predict road conditions, driver conditions, everything else, integrate that information, but how to transmit the chance of an accident to the driver. And for them the question was, well, we could just have that throbbing red light. That's what our engineers came up with. That was what was actually used on road. But does knowing about the neuroscience help at all? Is there any reason to be interested in multisensory integration at the Colliculus level or the results from psychological research? The challenge for us was to try and see, could we use insights from the neuroscience to help Toyota design better warning signals than their clever and intelligent engineers could come up with without knowing about the brain, just using intuition instead. That's kind of a challenge. It's easy enough to show that a warning signal helps, but to do something better than the best intuitions of the engineers who've been working in this area for decades is hard. But I think after a few years, we were able to convince the to Brussels, who we were working for, the neuroscience play a role, and there were insights you could get from studying multisensory integration in cats or awake humans. Kind of the two or three of the key ones I think that came out was first the idea that multisensory warning signals give you a benefit. When you see that superadditive slide, and you see what potential there is for superadditive multisensory integration, then you think much more about using multisensory warning signals. Just having that throbbing red light, sure it signals danger, but it's just not. You can do so much better by using multiple senses, vision and hearing and touch, all three at the same time. And we have laboratory research to show in the lab or in a driving simulator, drivers are far more likely to have their attention captured and reoriented to the road if you use multisensory warning signals rather than unisensory. Some engineers had a kind of a finger on the psychological literature and had heard something about multisensory, so some of the other companies were already thinking about multisensory warnings. But there too, I think, what you see in much of the psychologically inspired engineering research in this area is that people will think about vibrating the driver's pants and playing a sound. That's multisensory, it should work, shouldn't it? It doesn't. Time and again it doesn't. And then you look at the methods of those studies and you find they vibrated the driver's backside and they played a sound from up here. That's not the same location. That's precisely the situation in the laboratory or in the anaesthetized animal that gives rise to suppression. Is it any surprise they didn't find an enhancement in the driving simulator? So I think here again, the neuroscience helps in really emphasizing the importance of co-location. Again, we have research to show if the sound and touch come from different locations, they don't capture your attention anything like as effectively. Put them in the same location, and your brain just cannot ignore it, no matter what else it happens to be doing at the same time. Thirdly, this is work that's ongoing, more in Germany, from the German car manufacturers, is that when you think, and to lead into the next part of the talk, when you're thinking about sensory signals, the engineer might say, well, have the sound, the vision, and the touch at the same time. Why on earth wouldn't you? Well, in fact, if you're thinking, whereabouts in the driver's brain do I want these signals to converge? Is it the colliculus, involved in orienting, or somewhere else? Then maybe you start thinking that desynchronizing the signals might actually give rise to better performance, faster responses than having synchronized ones. That's research that's ongoing, but again, inspired by the neuroscience. And finally, the intuitive engineer, if he or she knows nothing about psychology, will kind of tend to think of space, our representation of space, as a unitary thing. I see no boundaries between peripersonal space and space I can't touch. I see no difference, I feel no difference between space in front of me and space behind. But it turns out that the neurophysiologists have shown that there are different ways of coding bits of space. The space in front, the space we can reach, peripersonal space, the space outside of our reach, and most exciting for us, the space just behind your head. One never thinks about stimulating people there, but it turns out this is a very vulnerable part of our anatomy, and that neuropsychological research, psychophysical research, and now applied research shows if you present warning signals from just behind the head, again, they automatically capture attention far better than signals at any other location, at least hearing and touch. Again, something that's only come out of the neuroscience and is sort of helping the engineers here. So I think there's one company at least who have been convinced that knowing about the neuroscience and the psychology of multisensory integration can help them to deliver real products that are more effective and attention capturing to their consumers. So that's all good. But I guess one mustn't get carried away. Space isn't always important. You can read a lot of the psychophysics literature over the last few years. Myself, own work, kind of is equally guilty of this. And we've been so caught up in the single cell model, we think spatial coincidence always matters. You'll always get better performance, better perception. That turns out not to be the case. And for any number of phenomena now, it seems that spatial coincidence doesn't matter. Take the two faces I showed you a moment ago. It doesn't matter where in the room I place the loudspeaker that plays the sound, you'll get just as strong a McGurk effect. Even if you can say the lips are on the screen but the loudspeaker's over there, you'll still show a visual capture or modulation of auditory perception. You'll still perceive the illusion. So spatial coincidence doesn't matter for the McGurk effect. Take another illusion. I present one flash of light in the periphery. I play two sounds. What do you see? You'll see two flashes of light. This is the Damsham's colleagues' two-flash illusion. The idea being that in the temporal domain, hearing dominates, and you see two flashes rather than one. Here again, spatial coincidence does not matter in the slightest. Put things in the same place, the sound somewhere else from the lights, the effect is just as strong. Third example, auditory driving. If I give you a light flashing away, I play a sound that's fluttering at a different frequency, you'll see the light flashing closer to the rate at which you hear the sound fluttering. That effect completely unaffected by spatial coincidence. Temporal ventriloquism, temporal recalibration, brightness enhancement. The list goes on and on. Many, many multisensory integration effects are completely insensitive to spatial co-localization. Enough now that there's a real clear kind of dichotomy or distinction between those studies that do show spatial coincidence is important and those that do not. And we think about what is common to all of these examples, null effects of spatial coincidence, in a way they all involve kind of stimulus identification and or temporal perception. So to try and draw some kind of conclusions about when does space matter and when does it not, it seems that spatial coincidence does matter in tasks where you have to orient, be it with the eyes, your head, make a limb movement, or be it in cases where the attentional orienting is covert, when I just shift my attention but not my gaze. Spatial coincidence also seems to be important whenever the task is in any sense spatial. If I have to make a spatial discrimination, only respond to stimuli in certain locations but not others. When spatial coincidence doesn't matter at all, in tasks involving simple detection of a stimuli, was there something there or not? What was the thing that was there? Spatial coincidence doesn't matter. When did it happen? At what rate? Spatial coincidence doesn't matter. And I think we're going to see more and more examples as the years go by now of where situations where space doesn't matter at all. I mean, there are different principles for integrating stimuli depending on the task at hand. So given space often isn't important at all, what other rules do we have that might facilitate binding? Well, one of the kind of second rule that came out of the single cell research was temporal coincidence. That was key to binding. How important is it? How difficult is it to maintain the co-registration of signals when you have different sensor systems with different latencies and so on? The sort of way that psychologists would typically address this question is to give people pairs of stimuli, perhaps a light and a sound. You have to say which one came first. Some examples will be easy for the subject to determine. That's clearly vision first. This one is clearly audition came first in time. And what we're interested in is all those stimuli in between at asynchronous, where it's really hard to say which one came first, or whether they were simultaneous or successive. And we put many, many different kinds of stimuli into this sort of psychophysical testing in order to try and figure out how big is the temporal window over which humans and other animals will integrate signals, or how much do they have to be separated in time for the brain to treat them as separate, independent, unimodal events. The sort of results we might get, say from a simultaneity judgment task, here in humans, with very simple stimuli, a flash of light, a beep, a few milliseconds long, we find that when the stimuli are roughly synchronous, here in the middle, people nearly always judge them to be synchronous, and your perception of simultaneity drops off as you'd expect as one sense comes before the other. Well, you can see we've got two psychometric functions here. One when the stimuli actually came from the same location in space, the top function, and function below when they were presented from different locations. What that shows is that you're more likely to bind signals across time if they come from the same location, where you have a narrower temporal window of integration for stimuli from different locations. You're more likely to treat them as separate sensory events. And that here for simple stimuli with no semantic meaning, we have a window of integration of something like a couple of 100 milliseconds. Slightly offset from true veridical simultaneity, but only by about 10 or 15 milliseconds. Go to another class of stimuli, but with the same task. Now looking at speech perception, how sensitive are you there to asynchrony? How big is the window of integration over which you can bind what you hear and what you see to enhance speech perception or to hold on to a sense of synchrony? Well, here we have the width of the temporal window as a function of a study, about 10 or 15 different studies here. And two points to note. One is that the window is fairly wide. In some studies, like in this one from Don Massaro and colleagues, it's about nearly half a second wide, the window within which you integrate. So the brain doesn't seem to be overly sensitive to asynchrony, at least for speech stimuli. On top of that, you see that the results vary quite a lot from study to study. Most of these are well-controlled psychophysical studies, and yet the window is kind of twice as large in some studies as in others. Why is that? It may be if you use short, brief speech stimuli versus continuous segments of speech that changes the width of the window. It may be the particular speech sounds that you use. So I think that the speech is in a way special or different from simple beeps and flashes, and there's a wider window of temporal integration. And if one looks in the brain at subjects in such a speech temporal synchrony judgment or ternary task, you have to say, is the speech synchronous? Do the lips come first, or does the voice come first? You look in their brain to see where the activation is, and where that activation changes as a function of your perceptual state. The stimuli are the same. All that's changing moment by moment is whether the stimuli are fused, hearing seems to be first, or vision seems to be first in this ongoing video. And what we find is that in the mid-superior temporal sulcus, areas of activation that correspond to the different perceptual states. So here we find that when people perceive a stimulus as auditory leading, we see a focus of activation here. When vision is perceived as leading, the focus of activation shifts a little bit along STS. But when you perceive the stimuli as synchronous, activation actually falls in between audition first and vision first. Here's group data from about 14 participants, but every single participant showed the same pattern of results, that the focus of activation for synchrony perception was in between that of audition first and vision first. So for us, some suggestive evidence that the brain may code temporal events, temporal perception, in terms of some sort of spatial code here. You might even have a timeline running along STS. For speech stimuli at least, whether it's true for other non-speech stimuli, we don't know as yet. So we have a window of integration. It's wider for more ecologically valid stimuli, maybe more informationally rich stimuli, maybe if the stimuli we're more familiar with, like speech. It's slightly offset from synchrony. But there are many situations in which knowing whether what you hear and see were actually synchronous is very hard, due to various biophysical, physical, and cognitive factors. Take the case of thunder and lightning. Here's the one example maybe where we're all aware that we see the lightning a few seconds before we hear the thunder. Those two events were synchronous out there, but the delay induced by the time it takes the sound to reach our ear, travelling much more slowly through the medium of air, maybe 2 or 3 seconds. Our brain just can't pull those things back into alignment. So some delays are noticeable. Just how far can something be away from us and we still hold on to the perception of unity or simultaneity, and when does that break down? Are there any neural mechanisms that help us to recalibrate for the delay in sound, given that any sound that's further away will always be delayed? The other problem the brain's facing here with different sensor systems coding temporal events is that the speed of neural processing differs hugely between the senses. If I look at drop something on your tongue, stick something up your nose, it'll take about 150 to 200 milliseconds for that stimulus to be transduced in the nasal epithelium or on the tongue. For vision, somewhat faster, but maybe 25, 40 to 60 milliseconds, depending on the brightness of the light and its eccentricity. Touch, faster still, maybe 15, 25 milliseconds to process a tactile stimulus at the skin. Again, it'll take longer if you're colder for the signal to be transduced to the brain. It takes longer for signals that are further from your brain to reach it. And fastest of all, the kind of mechanical transduction in the ear and hearing. 1 or 2 milliseconds compared to 200 milliseconds out here. Again, how does the brain maintain a sense of synchrony, put things into temporal alignment now rather than spatial alignment, to glue together what really should go together and keep separate what really should be kept apart? The answer from the neurophysiologists on this score is that maybe what the brain does is, rather than trying to bring everything back into alignment, we just have a wide window for integration. We say anything within 600 milliseconds, according to some of the early neuroscience research, we'll just glue it together. And that way we can forget about physics, we can forget about transduction latencies for the most part. And what that would mean is that I kind of glue together the size of this cat here, perhaps with sounds coming from a whole range of different distances. And I think in some situations, we awake humans also have a wide window for temporal integration. And this might be particularly true for speech, because if you look at speech signals, different consonants, fricative stop consonants, so on, here, each one of these is a different type of consonant. Down here, the vowels. All the subjects are doing here is judging, did they see the lips move or hear the voice first, as they're presented with the various different classes of consonants and vowels. And what we see from the same subjects in the same session, just a different trial, is a difference in the window of integration. That here, for vowels, you're more likely to perceive them as synchronous when the sound comes maybe 60, 75 milliseconds before the lip moves. For consonants, by contrast, it's shifted slightly the other way, that vision has to come first for simultaneity. So these are all speech stimuli, but what counts as simultaneous is dependent on the particular speech sound or gesture that you're making. And hence, if I'm trying to understand what somebody's saying, maybe I need a kind of a wide window of integration in order to capture all those different asynchronies depending on when the lips move with respect to the voice. So here we have someone saying something like the cat sat on the mat, so on and so forth. But for each speech sound starting each of those words, we'll have a slightly different window of integration, slightly different perceived point of simultaneity. And the best way to perceive the whole sentence as synchronous is perhaps to have a wide window to it altogether. And that might be why the window for integration generally for speech is larger than for non-speech stimuli. That also helps, of course, if you're interested in sort of TV satellite broadcasting, where again we have a problem of delay, of uncertain lags between the signal being sent in one modality and another that can lead to problems in these kind of remote satellite broadcasts. And there we have kind of the International ITU guidelines about what's an acceptable lag, what the TV viewer won't notice, of about 170 milliseconds. What our research suggests is that it might be very specific to speech stimuli, but be far more sensitive to asynchrony for other classes of non-speech, but ecologically valid stimuli. So a wide window works for some situations, but not all. I'll show you an example of some really nice work from the Netherlands, from Erik van der Berg and his colleagues at TNO and the University of Amsterdam, where they give people visual search tasks, like the one you see here. We have a little bit hard to see, very hard to see, red and green line segments. It's kind of a complex visual display. Those red and green line segments are changing randomly every 100, 150 milliseconds or so. Most of the line segments are oriented at plus minus 45 degrees. And your task is to say, try and detect the horizontal or vertical line, which is the target in amongst those. So in this case, the target is kind of up here, flickering red to green. That's the one vertical element in amongst all these other ones. It's a very difficult task. If you do this in the laboratory, it takes subjects an average of 3 to 6 seconds, depending on the set size, to spot the target. Here's another example. The target doesn't pop out. It's kind of an effortful, attention-demanding, slow, serial visual search. And here's the target down here. So far, it's just regular visual search, complex displays, hard to detect targets. But what was very exciting about their research is what happens when you add a sound that's synchronized with the now we have the target down here. It's a little bit hard to hear. And if you have the monitor in the laboratory rather than over, this is kind of the synchrony problem all over again. I'm not quite sure what the delay is on that monitor. If things happen synchronously, then the target pops out much more. Normally. I didn't see that one. One last example, I think it should work. There we go. So exactly the same search displays, purely visual task, task-irrelevant sound presented. It's non-spatial, and yet it'll reduce search latencies by about 3 seconds, halve them. The benefit obviously increases as a function of this increase in set size of the display. So here we have a cross-modal facilitation. Visual search is radically enhanced by the presentation of a spatially non-specific sound. If you actually make the sound spatially informative, then performance gets better still. If I tell you which side of the screen with a beep on the left or the right of the screen. That will make you search faster. If I spatially co-localize the sound with this visual display, put the loudspeakers at the side of the monitor rather than over headphones, the benefit gets bigger still. So space isn't essential to this cross-modal enhancement, but you do see an added benefit of spatial co-localization. And I think what may be going wrong here is that this projector has this uncertain delay, so you lose exact temporal synchrony here. When you do the experiment in the lab with a carefully controlled monitor, you have precise control over synchrony, the target pops out. If you just deliberately desynchronize the sound and the visual event, by a few tens of milliseconds, the benefit goes away. So this suggests, for this complex display at least, the window for integration has to be much narrower in order to avoid false combinations. So here we see a very narrow window of integration leading to multisensory enhancement, whereas for speech, it was much wider. So it may be that the more stimuli that are out there, either spatially, or there's research coming out now saying that the more temporal stimuli there are in succession, the narrower the window you have. And maybe it's flexible in size to deal with the particular situations you happen to find yourself in. So I think this wide window of integration obviously can't always work, as the pip and pop example shows. What other mechanisms have the psychologists and neuroscientists suggested help to bind stimuli correctly? Well, two main ones. One popular idea from Engel and Doherty in 1970, but rediscovered by Sugita and Suzuki in 2003, both in Nature, is the idea that given the predictable delay in sounds as a function of distance from us, maybe we just have a movable window of integration as a function of distance. That helps to combine things appropriately and overcome physical lag of sound. A number of studies that provide support for that, some that don't, we're not quite sure why yet. And perhaps you say, well, why does thunder and lightning not work? There I always see the lightning before I hear the thunder. And Sugita and Suzuki would say, well, distance perception breaks down, maybe at 30, 40 meters. So maybe within the region of space when you can accurately estimate the distance of an event, distance constancy works in this movable window. Beyond that, you're in trouble. And the third possible account that's been proposed is this idea of a kind of a movable window for integration. And this is work from Moraine Zamir and colleagues over in Canada, that if I repeatedly present you with a beep and a flash that ought to go together, but I pull them apart by a tenth of a second, then after a few presentations, your brain says those should go together and will deliberately kind of pull them together, kind of a temporal version of the spatial ventriloquism effect. And they have some nice evidence for that. Teasing apart these two accounts is quite difficult, but I think they do make some subtly different predictions that researchers are currently testing. And that maybe we need multiple mechanisms to maintain temporal coincidence. So space does matter sometimes, it doesn't. Time does a lot, but the window of integration seems to vary as a function of the stimuli presented, perhaps the task, and so on. I just want to finish up looking at a couple of other factors that I think are important to multisensory binding, but which the single-cell researchers can never really get a handle on in their anaesthetized preparations. One important factor is this idea of the unity assumption, which is that originally formulated in the 50s by Jackson and others back in Oxford, and then restated more forcefully by Welsh and Warren in 1980. The idea that we have beliefs, we have priors, we have expectations about what sort of stimuli go together, and surely it would make sense for our brains to use those priors and expectations in order to decide which stimuli to combine, especially in complex situations like the cocktail party, where there are many voices, many lips. I have this temporal problem, I have the spatial problem. Why not use my prior understanding that women typically have higher pitched voices in order to reduce the kind of binding problem? The idea's been around then for a long time from psychologists that things that we believe should go together or have prior reason to expect to go together will lead to enhanced binding. It's been kind of hard to show it, prove it experimentally, but I think we're seeing more and more studies over the last couple of years that really do so. I'll mention two. One from speech, because we've been looking at that. Here are some of the videos we've been using in our experiments. We have Holly uttering a vowel, syllable, word. That was a woman's face, a woman's voice. You think they should go together. What happens if I cross her face with a man's voice? Now, the unity assumption is broken, because a woman doesn't make a sound like that normally. And I can have all combinations of face and voice. Here's Steve's face and voice. Unity assumption should hold. Now, Holly's face, Steve's voice. All combinations matched for complexity, informational content. And what we find is the window of integration is larger. You're more likely to bind face and voice when they come from the same gender speaker, making the same speech utterance, and you're less likely to bind them. You're actually better at temporally resolving them when they mismatch in a way. So here, multisensory integration helping you, through the unity assumption, to bind things from further apart in time, and presumably also space. And actually making you worse in this task. So whether multisensory integration enhances or impairs performance is kind of task-dependent. One other example of this unity effect in action, kind of stimulated by the old work from the Kohler and colleagues back in the 1920s, kind of the famous Boo-Boo and Kiki effect. Again, the idea that we have certain sorts of correlations between stimulus attributes in different modalities, be it a man's figure and a deep voice, or here between sharp and rounded shapes and sharp and rounded speech sounds. If I say there are two shapes, one's Booba and one's Kiki, which one is which? Then wherever you go in the world, 1 out of 10 will agree with that, but the majority, no matter what the language, the culture, will say that's definitely the Kiki, the one on the right is definitely the Booba. So here's a kind of cross-modal correspondence. Everyone matches without having seen those shapes before. Wouldn't it make sense for our brains to use that matching or correspondence? You might call it a synesthetic correspondence to make sure you're more likely to bind this sound with this shape and this sound with this shape and not bind that sound with that shape instead. How to prove it? Well, the same temporal order judgment experiment, now using not faces, but these simple stimuli that either are synesthetically congruent, fit with one's priors or are not. So small shape, high tone, congruent. Big shape, low tone, congruent. You should hear. And all you're doing is just saying, did the circle come first or the sound? High or low pitch, big or small? So the shape, the sound are irrelevant. You're just doing an order judgment. Simplest experiment you could possibly imagine. But what it turns out is that pretty much every subject, I think 11 out of 12 here, show increased binding of the low pitch with the large shape and the small pitch, small shape with a high pitch, and less binding, a bigger window integration for the incongruent pairs of stimuli. Stimuli themselves are irrelevant to the task, and yet synesthetic or cross-modal correspondences, our knowledge of the world that big objects make low-pitched sounds, is impacting on multisensory integration. The same is true for another example. More angular shape, higher pitch. Combinations there. Very simple stimuli, just matching these different kind of cross-modal correspondences between size or angularity or pitch or elevation, various features, all seem to show the same result. Enhanced binding or stimuli that you have a prior belief should go together. That for the temporal domain. The same holds true in the spatial domain as well. If I do a ventriloquism experiment, not with the articulated dummy and the guy with a mustache, but with large or small blobs, high or low pitched tones, you'll find increased integration, synesthetically congruent. So these results together suggest that an extra factor that may mediate multisensory integration is this idea of using cross-modal correspondences, our prior knowledge about the world, that's built up through experience to help binding. And I guess Mark will hopefully talk tomorrow about how you can model such correspondence effects in terms of coupling priors. He's done some very nice work there, so you can learn these correspondences within a matter of trials, in less than an hour, and model them very nicely in Bayesian decision theory. So I think we have the behavioural evidence now to say that cross-modal correspondence, synesthetic correspondence, perhaps even semantic congruency between what we see and hear facilitate. So thinking back then, so what are the factors that modulate multisensory integration? Many factors, both spatial and temporal. Both spatial and temporal binding problems have problems about registration of stimuli when you have independent sensors that can move with respect to one another. How do you keep them in spatial alignment? But also with sensors that transduce information, or with information that's passed through the medium at different rates. How do you keep those events in alignment? Space matters sometimes, time does a lot. But as well as those factors, I think this synesthetic, semantic, causal congruency, these kind of more top-down factors are also important. If we can put them all in a list, we can say that factors modulating multisensory integration, spatial coincidence, temporal coincidence, maybe temporal patterning, correlation between signals over time may play a role. The unity effect, I showed you the example of the male and female speaker. Synesthetic congruency, big and small circles. Amodal matching, semantic congruency, again, more studies just coming out in these last 2 or 3 years showing the importance of, if you hear the dog, you see the dog, more binding. Gestalt grouping was mentioned by Tony, and there's more research there. And perhaps attention too. So a lot of different factors that help to bind or segregate signals. And these factors, you can think of them, and they're often all thought of as kind of bottom-up factors modulating integration. Factors that are driven by the stimuli themselves, where they are in space, when did they happen. Other more top-down factors that are kind of internal to the observer, their attentional state, for example. Maybe the unity effect is the belief that the observer has about the world or the setting or the stimuli affecting integration. So you see, you can think of these factors kind of separated into bottom-up and top-down factors, both contributing to binding. But the more you think about it, maybe the harder it gets to keep this distinction clear in one's mind, because spatial coincidence is always talked about as a bottom-up factor modulating attentional capture and integration. But if I'm a subject and I see a light there and I hear a sound here, that might induce a top-down bias not to bind them consciously. But the unity assumption is broken. The same for temporal factors. So many of these factors that we think of or often talk about as bottom-up structural factors modulating integration might also have a top-down role. And many of the top-down factors might actually turn out to be modulated in a way. What we call, perhaps some examples of the unity effect might be driven by kind of correlation, low-level correlation between the auditory and visual signals as much as by the observer's belief. So I think it's going to be a challenge for the years to come to try and figure out how to pull those two bottom-up, top-down factor apart. And I'll just leave you with one example where that's a problem at the moment. Remember I told you that one mechanism the brain seemed to use in order to maintain synchrony was kind of distance constancy, this movable window of integration depending on how far a sound was away from you. Well, if you look at the literature, 5 published studies in good journals say distance constancy works. 6 others say no, it doesn't. There's no evidence for distance constancy. Equally good psychophysicists, different laboratories. What's going on? Why can some people find this mechanism and others not? And there, I think if you look very closely at the methods, you find that perhaps the subjects in some of the experiments were told, imagine the sound and the visual event came from the same location. Maybe that top-down assumption of unity enhances binding, leads to distance constancy. Whereas the other subjects in the other experiments weren't given any of those top-down biases or beliefs, and hence kept the signals more separate. I'll leave it there. You'll just ask me to mention that, for those of you who don't know, next year in June in Sendai, in Japan, the 11th or the 12th, meeting the International Multisensory Research Forum. A lot of psychologists and psychophysicists and neuroscientists interested in these kind of topics will get together in Japan. And I think the emphasis for this meeting from the organisers is going to be much more in its engineering and virtual reality type applications, so there may be even more overlap with this group than there is in other years. All the information is starting to appear on the web just under IMRF. Leave it there.
The super additivity. I mean, we know all neurons have receptive field, and it's very meaningful that some neurons have receptive field centering around auditory or visual input. Others will have receptive field being maximized at compound additivity. So it's clear this is user has to be. We find that in the sense that I don't see what we learn from that. I mean, there's a need of the because it's used. So we find. So what, in a sense?
So there are a number of modelers working on trying to develop artificial systems. There's a big multi-million-pound project in the UK a couple of years ago. Got to the very last 2. That's trying to build some sort of artificial multi-sensing system that would use exactly the same response properties as those found in the Colliculus as a means of trying to integrate artificial sensing.
But I'm saying, even without measuring, we need. I mean, this is useful. There have to be somewhere these kind of neurons. I mean, some will be more on auditory, some more visual. So,
but in terms of we need to know about their sort of spatial profiles, perhaps their temporal profiles.
Okay,
and maybe name the populations of the percentages of different types of neurons might lead to different predictions, different ways of.
Okay, you say exactly the scales and whatever.
Right.
So the useful information is exactly the scales,
yeah.
the details of the scales.
After long-term exposure to a certain amount of delay between two multisensory signals, is there any evidence of adaptation? Yes, yeah.
Yes, there is. First reported by Fujisaki and colleagues in Nature Neuroscience in 2004, the audiovisual case. And there have been maybe 10, 20 studies since then looking at temporal recalibration for desynchronized audiovisual, visual, tactile, any combination of simple stimuli, and also increasingly now with more complex speech stimuli as well. So you do see temporal recalibration effects, even after only a few trials of presentation, in fact. You can see some signs of recalibration. And recalibration effects that not only kind of shift your perception of synchrony, but if I present you repeatedly with, say, a sound and a slightly delayed light, and then I test you on your simple detection latencies for sounds and lights, you'll find a speeding up or slowing down of those simple detection latencies to unimodal stimuli after recalibration. So it affects not only your perception of what's simultaneous, but also can affect very simple behavioral responses. It seems the temporal recalibration so far hasn't been complete. If you adapt people to a sort of 250 millisecond delay, then you might see 20, 30 milliseconds of shift. But that might just be a matter of the small number of training trials used. I think Mark Wallace in the States is just now starting to raise newborn cats in desynchronized environments, and shows there they can adapt perfectly, not yet published yet I think, but can adapt perfectly if they're brought up from birth in a 150 millisecond, 200 millisecond desynchronized environment. Beyond that, the Colliculus can't cope, but there is a certain degree of flexibility. And that it seems that maybe even, it's hard to know, after exposure to this temporal desynchronization, you get the recalibration. Does that recalibration affect just those stimuli you're presented with, or does it extend, generalize to other stimuli? Some work saying it can be quite stimulus specific, and that even if you present kind of sequentially stimuli, one person desynchronized in one direction, another speaker desynchronized in the other direction, so the lips come first for this person and after for that person, you may be able to get simultaneous recalibration in opposite directions to the different stimuli.
It follows from what you're saying that if you wanted to increase, maybe even increase intelligibility in, say, broadcasts or films or whatever, then it would help to perceive the sound and the lip moving as being simultaneous if the speaker, the sound source, was closer to the actual image that you're watching. So if you have your television speaker off to the left and you're looking here, then you're not going to be able to bind as well as if. Is that correct?
Yep.
Does that have a knock-on effect for intelligibility as well, so you can actually understand poor quality broadcasts better if the speaker is closer to the...
Yes, I think that would be the closest example of that would be kind of paper by Driver 96 in Nature. So, where actually co-localizing them helps, but even in situations where you can't, just using any kind of psychological tricks to convince the perceiver, the observer, that the sound seems to be coming from the front. So even just putting a dead loud speaker there might do some of the work in increasing intelligibility.
Right, that's exactly where I was going to go with this, because to comment on some of your points at the end about top-down versus bottom-up. Often the dependencies are stated in terms of the actual spatial location of the sound source, but might it not be merely the perceived location of the sound source? So that's why we have to include cognitive effects, and maybe some of the interpretations of data that were made in terms of actual location really are on perceived location.
I think again, Mark Kearns has got some nice data on that about sensory dominance, the function whether you believe things come from the same place, and you could use his case perhaps like mirrors, so you see it there, but you know it's there. Does that overcome the spatial? That said, there's kind of a famous paper by Driver in Nature 96 saying it's the perceived position of the sound that affects intelligibility. But there have been a couple of follow-up studies that haven't been able to replicate that in the States. It's a Human Factors journal, so maybe there are some other factors as well. So those top-down effects are maybe in some way less robust, a little harder to capture. How do I know how strong your belief that the sound's actually coming from the front? Or if you're in one of these temporal distance constancy experiments, and I say, really try as hard as you can to imagine that sound over headphones came from that light out there. Are you paying attention, or are you doing what you're told, or are you, maybe subject's different, it's much harder to measure those strength of belief.
first, but just so here we have a question. I believe there's one next to.
Charles, can you tell us something about the correlation between, let's say, the size of this multi-sensory integration window and the age of the subject? That is that related with cognitive development?
So there have been a few studies now looking at the size of the window as a function of age, and some evidence that it grows larger in older populations, 60 to 90. We've done that for vision and touch. I think Paul Orienti and Christina Schmidt have been doing it for hearing and vision. So some, not a huge widening, but significant widening in those 60, 70 upwards. In this area of aging and multisensory integration is one that's just starting to get, I guess, more popular now, that people feel they've got a handle on what's going on in normal adults. There's some nice work from Laurenti again, claiming that for the elderly, where you see the kind of the decline in each individual sense, they have some evidence that maybe the elderly people are able to use multisensory integration to overcome those unisensory decline in order to give them multisensory performance that's almost as good as young people. So there's some evidence kind of broadening the window, which might be like seen as a less sort of beginnings of the failure of integration. But on the other hand, there's orienting work saying, in fact, maybe the old have enhanced integration in order specifically to make up for unisensory loss. I think a lot more work.
How about very young kids, very young children?
David Lefkowitz has done a lot of work on that. I struggle off the top of my head to. He's been like 10 or 15 years looking at sort of narrowing a window and coming online of sensitivity to temporal correlation and then to rhythm. I think the detection of temporal synchrony is one of the earliest things that neonates use in order to decide what to bind.
Yes, I was wondering whether you know more on whether when you present stimuli in a different modality and integration doesn't happen because perhaps the window of interaction would be too large, whether those stimuli act as distractors and to what level they make response time, for example, longer.
So there are situations in which stimuli in different modality are not integrated, what effects they have. Maybe it's very much task dependent, kind of what happens. So, and on the specifics of the design. So, we have research and others now where exactly the same pair of stimuli with a mismatch that don't belong together, you might share that accessory irrelevant incongruent signal, speed you up in some sense. So the irrelevant sound acts as an alerting signal, so it makes your visual response is faster. If it's just a simple detection task, but if you're making a visual categorization response, then suddenly that incongruent distractor will slow you down. So there's maybe no easy generalization about what would happen when a distractor is in a different modality and incongruent and not bound. It really depends on just the task you're doing. It could make you faster because it alerts you, which is in a way sort of a multisensory effect, or it could slow you down because it's interfering with the response level or at some central level or both.
At some stage you mentioned also semantic collocation. This means that it's something which is trainable, because we have to learn that, to have the semantic I wonder whether the body language understanding is something related to that, or you think it's something totally different effect? Body language understanding, because there we associate the sound or what we hear with what we see effectively. So do you think that this is something related, or it's totally different?
Not sure.
Okay, John, you got the mic. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm a bit bothered by the fact that you seem to be equating perception with sensory input alone. Whereas I would much rather tend to think that perception, I mean, full perception in a real-life ecological situation of objects that are meaningful, the perception does not exist without action. It's a sensory-motor dynamics, and what constitutes the quality of the perceived object is not simply sensory input and information processing on the sensory input, but it's the way in which the entity we're perceiving changes when, for example, when we move around it, when our eyes move, and so on. But you didn't mention, so this whole dimension that action is necessary for perception was remarkably absent from everything you were saying. But it might change, or it might illuminate many of these phenomena. In other words, when you get these apparently rather surprising cross-sensory integrations, I would suggest it's in a situation where ecologically there'll be covariance with respect to actions that are causing covariance in both sensory inputs.
So I suppose my question is actually very closely related, and that is just to ask about the issue of expertise. So the typical kind of task you're talking about there is precisely the kind of thing that a person will never have practiced before, with the exception of speech, which is something basically all your participants would have been experts at. And it's kind of interesting that things stick out for speech that don't seem to be, the patterns for the speech tasks seem to be quite different to the patterns of the unpracticed ones. So I'm just wondering if there's some manner in which our expertise or our practice at a given task is what's governing the perception of simultaneity rather than the simple neurophysiology and space, as it were.
Do you know about any research that will try to link the size of the windows of integration with the speed of attention shifts? I'm just wondering whether this is the effect, for example, in aging people, that comes from the slowing down of neural processes overall, and whether anyone tried to relate that. It seems to be rather obvious, so I would really love to see the experiment on that. Okay.
The superior colliculus was presented here as rather something which is receiving information. And is it know where does it transmit information? Does it transmit it back to sensory modules or to another modules of brain which we could concern as a higher level processing? The superior colliculus, which integrates the sensory inputs, it receives information from the sensory modules, and where does it transmit it? Does it transmit it back to sensory modules or somewhere else in the brain?
Question might have been, correct me if I'm wrong, but is the integration in the superior colliculus sufficient for an experience of an integrated stimulus, or must it then be sent on somewhere else in order for experience to occur? So, we're almost out of time, but I thought in closing we might see if you had any thoughts about a question relating this work to the to cognitive systems research in general. So some cognitive systems researchers are concerned with modeling natural systems, and that's why they do cognitive systems. So some people construct are interested in cognitive systems, artificial cognitive systems, for their own sake, and maybe want to be inspired by biological case, but not really necessarily don't feel themselves held to that. So it seems to me, for those people, there are three possibilities. For any particular case of multisensory integration, it could be the case that there's some actual advantage for doing it that way, and that they should copy it therefore, or might benefit. Another possibility would be that it's a byproduct of something else that's advantageous. So it's a side effect, but it's a side effect that comes about because of something else that's a good design. And then the third possibility is that it's actually not advantageous, that it's actually, if an engineer could get rid of it, then it would be good if they did. So do you have any thoughts about those three possibilities? Is there anything, are some of them are some of them empty? In other words, is the last category empty? Do you think is it always the case that there's some advantage to having the senses affect each other this way, or is it sometimes it's actually interference? And I suppose the related point is that Stein emphasized how experiences can be improved and there's a synergistic effect. But I guess that can work the other way, that experiences can be less than the sum of their parts because of negative interference between. You might get less out of this wine if you hear this jackhammer going than you would. So it's not all positive, but either way we need to take it into account. draw this opening session to a close. There's coffee now and a poster session on the ground floor, so enjoy that. We can continue the discussion, but before we break, our organizer would like to have a few words. Let's thank Charles Spence one more time.